Hello and welcome back to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. And yet again, it is another day with significant developments throughout the front line. I guess we are about time to change the definition of significant because of how often it happens now. But we start out in the direction of No-mifka, where the significant developments here is that the Ukrainians launched their counterattack, which the Russians managed to repel. After that, an additional counterattack was launched by the Ukrainians, an even bigger one this time. And the Russians simply outmaneuvered that counterattack by launching or relaunching their offensive operations from the south and the north, to the point at which fighting has now reached the center of No-mifka, and the Russians actually went around and pincered the Ukrainian forces in the east of the town. According to Russian sources, they managed to cut off the Ukrainian forces in the east and encircle the Ukrainian forces there. According to this report, the Russians managed to withdraw to the east of the town, after which they faced off against the Ukrainian soldiers. Then they launched their assaults from the flanks, both the north and the south, to flank the Ukrainian positions with this pincer maneuver and managed to cut them off completely before moving on to the center of the town. So with this development, according to the sources, the Russians would then have gained control over the east of the town and have destroyed a large part of the Ukrainian forces defending this town. So we'll have to see if this information is accurate. The front line will move to the center of the town within a couple of days, or even to the western parts, while if the Ukrainians still have a significant force here and manage to deal with this Russian counterattack, then they should keep the fighting to the east of the town, or possibly even be pushed to the center. Regardless of that, we see that there is an additional effort by the Russians, and they have sent additional forces to the town to deal with the Ukrainian forces. There was information about this maneuver earlier on today, where the Russian sources there mentioned that there was a lot of chaos within the eastern parts of the town, because this is prior to the battle ended. The information said that the Russians launched offensive operations from the south, which managed to get behind the Ukrainian soldiers, and then there was this communication issue where the Russians weren't really aware exactly where within the town their forces were. Were they in the eastern, central, or somewhere in between, and how exactly was everything? But in the end, the same source reported on later on that they confirmed the situation, they flanked the Ukrainian soldiers, and they managed to bypass the eastern parts and are now fighting in the central parts of the town. So we'll have to see in the coming days exactly how accurate this information is. So far, the source has been very reliable, but there is always the possibility that information turns out to be false in the end. That is why we have to be very careful with what we hear, especially such a high-tier maneuver. It can easily be fabricated, similar to when the Ukrainians claimed that they had encircled 4,000 soldiers in Avdiivka. That is, of course, false information, because I'm not even sure it is physically possible for 4,000 Russian soldiers to fit inside of this tiny village. So with that, we have to take all of this information with a grain of salt when it comes to exactly how a fight takes place and the outcome of it and so on. This is why I'm very hesitant about talking about casualties and so on, but we will have to see with the territorial changes. This only confirms that the battle was taking place as they mentioned, so this gives some credibility to the report. The question is, will the front line move in a western direction, or will the Ukrainians be able to push the Russians back and force them back to the eastern outskirts of the village again? We then move on to the next part of the front line, which is yet again a significant development, as the Russians have pushed further in the central direction of the city of Avdiivka, as well as to the western direction, where the Russians now have control over the car depot, main area of the car depot, as well as here in the northern parts towards the coke plant. And with these developments, the Russians are only 300 meters from the main supply line. So the Russians are 300 meters and have clear direct vision of the main supply route in and out of the city. And with this, Avdiivka is now officially operationally encircled. With this, the Ukrainians have a significant difficult issue when it comes to the supply of the city, the supply of the soldiers there, and additional reinforcements coming to the city, because they would be under direct fire by Russian soldiers. This is because the supply line here to the north of the citadel area is only a couple hundred meters, if not somewhere around a kilometer, from direct view of the Russian soldiers, who, as you can see here, there's an open field and then a small forest area. But most importantly, there would be ability for the Russians to launch direct fire against any units going through that road. It is considerably safer now than the road here to the north, which is only 300 meters. And again, that's just an open field between the Russian positions and the Ukrainian positions. And now it's only a question of time before the Russians simply move these 300 meters and cut off the road physically, getting Avdiivka even closer to a complete encirclement of the city. As for the developments here in the center of the city, with this we see that there is additional movement by the Russians next to the lake, and they're getting closer and closer to the central parts of the city. With this, the Russians will have a much easier time getting the heights here to the east of the lake, as they can advance towards it from two directions. And if the Russians manage to gain control of the heights, the Russians would have direct fire control over the supply line in and out of this fortification to the very east of Avdiivka. This would force the Ukrainians to withdraw from it under fire, or simply hold their possessions without any supplies. And again, that would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to deal with such a situation. At the same time, if the Russians continue pushing here in the western direction and even get closer to the road here to the north of the citadel area, whether from the southern direction or from the northern direction, the Russians could, in that scenario, completely cut off the supplies in and out of the city, and the Ukrainian soldiers within the city, which numbers in the thousands, would be in a very difficult situation, as they would have no more supplies coming to the city. At the same time, they are being heavily bombarded all the time by FAB bombs, as well as heavy artillery and so on, which makes it very difficult for them to even hold their positions within the city. So we are entering the Avdiivka endgame. The endgame, as I define it, is when the battle over a city is reaching towards the end, the majority of the time has passed, and what is left is a short time where the fighting is not over control of the city, but over how long it takes for the Ukrainians to simply lose. Because that is the situation right now. The Ukrainians cannot make a comeback from this unless they launch a massive counteroffensive, which, to be honest, Syrskyi could do, because he's that type of person who would. But it is very difficult to see the Ukrainians succeed in such an operation, because they have not had necessary time or material to prepare for such an operation, and launching such an operation would leave Ukraine in a situation, even if succeeding with this operation, in a situation where they are simply too vulnerable to do anything, and the Russians would likely just recapture all of the lost positions. So the situation in Avdiivka is very, very, very difficult for the Ukrainians, and all they can do is hold on for as long as possible or withdraw from the city in an evacuation, which it seems that they are not planning on an evacuation, as Syrskyi promised Zelensky to hold on to the city. Therefore, it is likely that the Ukrainians will simply stay in the city until the last man. We then move on in a northern direction towards Avdiivka, where there has been an additional advance by the Russians, as per this geolocated footage, which shows Russian soldiers advancing here towards the village itself from the forest lines. And with this, we're seeing that there is a genuine offensive by the Russians here in the direction of Avdiivka. After the capture of the industrial zone to the east, they're now moving through to the center of the village to try and capture the village itself, which is fairly isolated from other Ukrainian positions, but it's also heavily fortified, which makes it difficult to fight over. Finally, we move on in the northern direction, where there has been a video here which shows a T-90M fighting a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle here in the forest lines, and with this we see that there are these territorial changes. This, however, is likely not an offensive operation, but simply positional fighting between the two sides. But with this, we see that there has been significant developments yet again, mainly focused around Avdiivka and No-mifka, as Russians are using a lot of forces in this section of the front line. But this brings me to a question someone asked me, and that is, how long do you believe that the Russians can continue with these offensive operations? To that I answered in a very simple manner. But before you hear my answer, you have to listen to what the Western media is saying. And what the Western media is saying, and Ukraine is saying, is that by spring, Russia would have used up all their offensive capabilities and it would simply removed back to the defensive. And what I say to that is that it is simply bogus. The reason for that is that the Russian army is currently growing day by day. On average, they report an additional 1,000 soldiers recruited to the armed forces every day. If the Russians lose 1,000 a day, then it is at a sustainable degree. 1,000 casualties a day is what Ukraine is reporting, and they are likely over-reporting. In that sense, the Russians are growing every day, not decreasing every day. This means that what they're currently doing is at a sustainable rate. That means the Russians can continue indefinitely at this rate. If they increase their offensive operations to a point where they received maybe 2,000 or 3,000 casualties a day, at that point, the Russians couldn't continue indefinitely. But theoretically, as of right now, the Russians can continue this indefinitely until winter 2024 or winter 2030. It doesn't matter. The Russians at this rate, at the current rate of recruitment and losses, they can continue for as long as they want to. So that is the current situation. They are not using too much equipment. They're not losing too much equipment. They're not losing too many men. They're recruiting enough men. So essentially, theoretically, the Russians can continue with these offensive operations at the small scale, at the front line, towards these defensive positions indefinitely. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.